August 17th, 1943, 26,000 feet above the Dutch-German border. Captain Robert Mac McAllister's P-47 Thunderbolt shuddered as cannon rounds from the Fuvel 190 behind him punched through his left wing. The German pilot had locked onto his six with textbook precision, closing the distance with every second. Mac's airspeed indicator trembled at 320 miles per hour. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 screaming at full military power. But it wasn't enough. The Focke-Wulf was faster in the dive, more maneuverable in the turn, and the pilot behind him knew it. Mac's right hand moved to the fuel jettison lever, an emergency control most pilots never touched outside of catastrophic damage. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio, sharp with alarm, calling him to brake left, brake right, do something conventional. Mac ignored it. He yanked the jettison lever full open. A white vapor trail erupted from beneath his Thunderbolt, a massive plume of 100-octane aviation fuel streaming into the frozen air at 5 gallons per second. Then he chopped the throttle, dropped the nose 45 degrees, and let the 7-ton fighter fall like a wounded bird trailing what looked exactly like catastrophic fuel or hydraulic failure. The German pilot saw it. Every pilot knew what that vapor trail meant. Aircraft hit, systems failing, pilot losing control. An easy kill spiraling down. What the Luftwaffe ace didn't know was that Mac McAllister had just executed the most controversial, ridiculed, and effective desperation tactic anyone would witness in the European air war. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be dissected, debated, and ultimately weaponized by Allied Fighter Command for the remainder of the war. For 14 months, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had been the workhorse of the 8th Air Force, escorting B-17 flying fortresses deep into German airspace. On paper, it was an impressive machine. 7 tons of aircraft wrapped around the most powerful radial engine ever mounted in a single-seat fighter, the 18-cylinder R-2800 producing 2,000 horsepower. 8 Browning M2, 50-caliber machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, delivering a combined weight of fire that could saw a German fighter in half. Armor plating protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, systems redundancy that brought pilots home with damage that would have killed men in Spitfires or Mustangs. But by the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt pilots of the 56th Fighter Group knew an uncomfortable truth. Above 25,000 feet, the Fi-190 owned them. The German fighter could outturn the P-47 inches horizontal flight. It could outroll it in combat maneuvering. Most devastatingly, the Focke-Wulf's BMW radial engine didn't lose power at altitude the way American fighters did, giving Luftwaffe pilots the option to dictate every engagement, diving when they held advantage, climbing away when they didn't. The statistics backed up the terror. In July 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 37 P-47 seconds in air-to-air combat, most to 5. 190 seconds that bounced American formations from above and disappeared before escorts could respond. Pilots who survived described the German aircraft as impossibly fast in the roll and unpredictable in the turn. Standard fighter command doctrine, perfected in the Battle of Britain, assumed you could outmaneuver an attacker if you saw him coming. Against the 190, seeing him coming wasn't enough. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, had pushed his pilots to master the Thunderbolt's singular advantage, dive speed. The P-47's weight and aerodynamic refinement meant it could accelerate faster in a dive than any German fighter, reaching speeds approaching 550 miles per hour before control surfaces stiffened to immobility. Zemke's tactical guidance was blunt. When a 190 jumps you, go down. Don't turn, don't climb, don't fight. Dive until he breaks off, then zoom back to altitude and rejoin your element. It worked, mostly. Survival rates improved. But it wasn't combat, it was survival. American fighter pilots were supposed to protect bombers, engage the enemy, assert air superiority. Instead, they were running. Every dive meant abandoning position, leaving bombers exposed, surrendering the initiative. The psychological cost was measurable. Pilots who survived multiple combat tours described a learned helplessness, a fatalism that came from knowing you'd be bounced, you'd dive, you'd escape, and tomorrow you'd do it again. Intelligence desperately needed an answer. Captured full 190 seconds were being studied at Wright Field in Ohio. British test pilots at Farnborough were wringing out every performance characteristic, but combat is not a test flight. In actual battle, German pilots held position advantage, tactical experience, and the confidence that came from 6 months of outperforming American escorts. The 8th Air Force needed more than engineering data. They needed a psychological weapon, something that would make Luftwaffe aces hesitate, second-guess, break off attacks even when they held every advantage. They found it in the most unlikely place. A desperation maneuver invented by a pilot who'd been disciplined twice for violating fuel conservation protocols. Captain Robert McAllister, 24 years old, engineering degree from Penn State, 2 aerial victories, and a reputation among his squadron mates as the man who'd try anything once. His wingman described him as technically brilliant and tactically insane, a backhanded compliment that would prove more accurate than anyone expected. What McAllister discovered during a training flight in June 1943 would become the most debated innovation in American fighter tactics, and the Luftwaffe's introduction to it would come at 26,000 feet over enemy territory with live rounds in the air. German fighter pilots in Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 26, the units responsible for defending the approaches to the Ruhr industrial region, had developed a dismissive nickname for American P-47 pilots by mid-1943, Dive Amerikaners. The term carried contempt. Luftwaffe aces, who'd survived 3 years of combat against the RAF, who'd flown over Spain and France and Russia, watched American fighters scatter downward every time a 190 made a high-side pass. Major Walter Oisau, credited with over 100 aerial victories, wrote in a tactical assessment circulated to his pilots, "The American large fighter is fast in escape, slow in aggression. Pilots demonstrate competent but defensive flying. They do not seek combat when disadvantaged." He was right. The numbers proved it. Through July and early August 1943, American fighter pilots in P-47 seconds claimed 42 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. German records, cross-referenced by post-war historians, confirmed 27 actual losses. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighters claimed 96 American fighters destroyed over the same period. Allied records confirmed 71. The kill ratio was nearly 3-1 in Germany's favor, and every Luftwaffe pilot knew it. What made the situation particularly galling for American pilots was that their commanders knew it too. Back at 8th Air Force headquarters in England, analysts were frantically studying gun camera footage, debriefing surviving pilots, trying to understand why training superiority and numerical advantage wasn't translating into combat success. The conclusion was uncomfortable. American pilots were technically proficient, but psychologically on the defensive. They flew their aircraft according to the manual. German pilots flew theirs according to what worked. Captain McAllister's fuel jettison maneuver had been demonstrated to his squadron commander in June during a training flight over the English Channel. He'd explained the concept. Dump fuel to create a massive vapor trail, drop the nose, simulate a catastrophic hit, sucker the pursuing fighter into following through the dive while you retained full power and control. At 10,000 feet, you snap throttle back to full, pull the aircraft level, and the pursuer, believing he's chasing a crippled aircraft, is suddenly nose down, slow, and vulnerable, with an enemy fighter behind him that isn't crippled at all. The squadron commander's response was immediate and unambiguous. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. You want to dump hundreds of pounds of fuel in combat? You want to deliberately make your aircraft look damaged? What happens when you're actually hit and need that fuel to make it home?" Disapproved. Don't do it again. McAllister didn't argue. He filed the maneuver away, a theoretical option for a theoretical emergency. His wingman, Second Lieutenant James Cobb, privately asked him if he'd actually use it under fire. Mac's answer was characteristically blunt. "If I'm dead anyway, I might as well die doing something the bastard behind me doesn't expect." Neither man realized that on August 17th, with German cannon rounds chewing through his wing and a Focke-Wulf ace closing for the kill, Mac would get his chance to find out if theory worked in practice. Before we continue with what happened in those next 90 seconds, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard about unconventional fighter tactics like the fuel dump decoy dive. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about McAllister's maneuver before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history that go beyond the standard textbook stories, hit that subscribe button. These accounts take serious research to separate fact from myth, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Captain Robert McAllister was not flying casually when the German bounced him. He was escorting the trailing box of B-17 seconds from the 381st Bomb Group, 45 flying fortresses returning from a raid on ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The bombers were chewed up, streaming vapor trails of their own from damaged engines and riddled fuel tanks, limping west at 160 miles per hour and losing altitude. The FW-190 had dropped out of the sun at 30,000 feet, a classic high-side attack that gave him every advantage: speed, position, surprise. Mac saw him late. 2 seconds of warning, maybe 3, the flash of sunlight on a canopy and the silhouette snapping into a firing position 800 yards behind. Mac broke right, hauling the Thunderbolt's control stick into his gut, but the 190 anticipated, rolled inverted, and pulled through to follow. The first burst went wide, the second didn't. Mac felt the impacts before he heard them. A rippling shudder through the airframe as 20mm cannon shells walked across his left wing, blowing fist-sized holes through aluminum skin and tearing through the wing's internal structure. His wingman, Lieutenant Cobb, was 1,000 feet above and a quarter-mile away, too far to help, screaming into the radio for Mac to dive. Mac was already diving, nose dropping, airspeed building, the altimeter unwinding through 24,000 feet. The German followed. Of course he followed. This was exactly what Luftwaffe pilots train for. The American runs, you chase him down through the dive, close to 400 yards, put a 3-second burst into his engine or cockpit, watch him burn or bail out, then zoom back to altitude for the next one. But Mac wasn't running. His left hand reached for the fuel jettison lever, that red-painted T-handle beneath the throttle quadrant, the one with the warning stenciled above it. Emergency. Use only. He pulled it. Hard. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Aviation fuel erupted from the jettison ports on the P-47's belly, atomizing in the slipstream, creating a white vapor trail that looked exactly like a ruptured fuel tank or severed hydraulic line. At 5 gallons per second, the plume stretched for a quarter-mile behind the Thunderbolt, a visual signature every combat pilot recognized. This aircraft is dying. Mac chopped the throttle to idle, killing the R-2000-800's roar to a whisper, and shoved the stick forward, dropping the nose to 45 degrees. The Thunderbolt fell, not dived, fell. Airspeed bleeding off, the aircraft wallowing in the thin air, the controls going mushy as aerodynamic pressure dropped. Every visual cue screamed, loss of control, catastrophic damage, pilot fighting a dead aircraft. The German pilot saw exactly what Mac wanted him to see. The range closed from 600 yards to 500, from 500 to 400. The few 190's nose tracked the falling Thunderbolt perfectly, the German pilot probably already savoring the gun camera footage. Another American escort destroyed, another kill marking to paint beneath his cockpit. Mac counted seconds. 3, 4, 5. The altimeter unwound through 20,000 feet. The vapor trail behind him stretched nearly half a mile, a white banner visible to every aircraft within 10 miles. Then Mac moved. His left hand slammed the throttle forward to full military power. 56 inches of manifold pressure, 2,000 horsepower smashing the propeller into the air, the R-2000, 800 transitioning from idle to full power in less than 2 seconds. His right hand hauled back on the stick, not gently, not by increments, but in one smooth, violent pull that loaded 4 G-forces onto the airframe and pressed him down into his seat with 800 pounds of effective weight. The P-47 Thunderbolt, all 7 tons of it, snapped level at 18,000 feet. The vapor trail vanished the instant Mac closed the jettison valve. The aircraft that had been falling wounded and helpless 3 seconds ago was suddenly straight and level with full engine power and 8 functioning machine guns. The German pilot in the fall 190 had 1 second to realize he'd been deceived. 1 second to process that the American wasn't crippled, wasn't dying, wasn't falling out of control. 1 second to understand that he'd followed his target through 8,000 feet of altitude, nose down, throttle forward, all his energy committed to the dive, and now that target was level behind him while he was still pointing at the ground. Mac didn't hesitate. He'd wargamed this moment in his head a dozen times during training flights. Throttle full forward, tight turn to put the 190 inches his gun sight, lead the turn by 2 aircraft lengths to account for the German pilot's inevitable break. The FW-190 tried. The pilot snap-rolled left, a violent maneuver that should have thrown off any pursuer. But Mac had altitude, he had energy, and he had the angle. His right thumb mashed down on the firing button. 8 Browning M2 machine guns opened fire. 50 rounds per gun per second. A combined rate of fire that put 400 half-inch diameter projectiles into the air every second. The convergence pattern was set for 300 yards. Mac was firing from 280. The first burst missed, tracers arcing over the 190's canopy by inches. The second burst hit. Mac saw the impact stitch across the German fighter's left-wing root and fuselage, metal fragments spinning away, smoke erupting from the engine cowling. The Focke-Wulf rolled right, hard, the pilot trying desperately to reverse his turn, to get separation, to escape. Mac followed. The range dropped to 200 yards. He fired again, a 4-second burst that emptied 160 rounds from each gun. The 190's canopy shattered, the right wing folded upward at an impossible angle, the spar broken, aluminum skin tearing like paper. Black smoke poured from the engine. The German fighter snap-rolled inverted and fell away, tumbling, pieces separating from the airframe. Mac didn't watch it go. Combat discipline. Check 6. Scan for threats. Verify your wingman. Lieutenant Cobb's voice in his headset, high-pitched with adrenaline. Mac, what the hell was that? I thought you were hit. I thought you were going down. Mac toggled his radio transmit. His voice was steady, almost conversational, the tone of a man discussing a routine maneuver. New tactic. Tell you about it when we land. Form on me. We've still got bombers to cover. His fuel gauge read 120 gallons remaining. He'd dumped 60 gallons in 10 seconds, enough fuel to fly for 30 minutes at cruise, burned off in a 10-second deception. Headquarters would have words about that. His squadron commander would definitely have words. But as Mac climbed back to 24,000 feet, scanning the sky for the next threat, he was already calculating the refinements. How much fuel was actually necessary to create the vapor trail? Could you practice the throttle timing on the recovery? How many times could you execute this before German pilots caught on? Below and behind him, 14,000 feet down, the wreckage of an FW-190 tumbled through scattered clouds toward the German countryside. The pilot, Lieutenant Franz Hagedorn, 22 years old, 11 victories, had bailed out at 12,000 feet and would survive with a broken collarbone and shattered illusions about American fighter tactics. His debriefing report, filed 3 days later at Jagdgeschwader 1 headquarters, included a sentence that intelligence officers would initially dismiss as combat stress. The American aircraft appeared catastrophically damaged, then recovered and engaged. I believe it was a deliberate deception. Nobody believed him. Not at first. Captain McAllister landed at Halesworth Airfield 90 minutes later with 35 gallons of fuel remaining, enough for 7 minutes of flight time. His crew chief, Master Sergeant Thomas Riley, counted 14 cannon shell holes in the left wing and 3 in the fuselage, none of which had struck critical systems. Mac's debriefing took 45 minutes, and by the end of it, Major David Schilling, operations officer for the 56th Fighter Group, was making notes with enough force to tear through the paper. Schilling was a meticulous officer, a former test pilot who'd transitioned to combat operations with the analytical mindset of an engineer. He listened to Mac's description of the fuel dump maneuver without interruption, asked 6 technical questions, and then said, "Show me the math." They worked it out on the chalkboard in the operations office that evening. A P-47 carried 305 gallons of internal fuel, enough for roughly 5 hours of cruise flight or 2 hours of combat operations, including takeoff, climb, engagement, and reserve for emergency. The fuel jettison system, designed for emergency situations where a pilot needed to reduce weight for wheels-up landings or bailout scenarios, could dump fuel at a maximum rate of 5 gallons per second. 10 seconds of jettison would dump 50 gallons, reducing total combat endurance by approximately 30 minutes. 15 seconds would dump 75 gallons, reducing endurance by 45 minutes. The critical calculation was vapor trail duration. Mac estimated that 10 seconds produced a vapor trail that persisted for roughly 45 seconds, more than enough time to execute the dive, level off, and re-engage. The visibility of the trail was exceptional. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing it from 12 miles away, and Lieutenant Cobb, flying escort 1,000 feet above, described it as looking exactly like a B-17 with a ruptured fuel tank. Major Schilling's next question was tactical. Could it be repeated? Mac's answer was carefully qualified. The maneuver worked because it violated every trained expectation. German pilots were conditioned to recognize specific visual signatures of damaged aircraft: vapor trails, erratic flight, loss of speed control. The fuel dump decoy exploited that conditioning. But if it became widely known, if Luftwaffe intelligence briefed their pilots on the tactic, the element of surprise would evaporate. This wasn't a repeatable doctrine. It was a one-time psychological weapon with a shelf life measured in weeks, maybe days. Schilling took the analysis to Colonel Zemke the next morning. Zemke, pragmatic and aggressive in equal measure, saw the implications immediately. He authorized limited tactical dissemination. 12 pilots in the 56th Fighter Group would be briefed on the fuel dump maneuver and authorized to use it at their discretion in emergency situations. No written orders, no official documentation, nothing that could be captured and analyzed if a pilot went down over enemy territory. Verbal briefing only, and the explicit understanding that using the tactic meant accepting a fuel penalty that could leave you walking home if the combat dragged on. The first deliberate use came 6 days later. Captain Gerald Johnson, leading a 4-ship flight over Hanover, executed the maneuver against 2 Bf-109 seconds that had bounced his element from above. Both German pilots followed him through the dive. Johnson leveled off at 15,000 feet, reversed, and shot down one Messerschmitt while the second broke off and ran for cloud cover. Johnson's combat report described the enemy pilots as confused and slow to react. His wingman's gun camera footage showed the moment of reversal, the German fighter's nose still pointing down while Johnson's P-47 snapped level and opened fire. Within 2 weeks, 8 more American pilots had executed variations of the fuel dump decoy. 6 resulted in German fighters destroyed or damaged. 2 resulted in tactical disengagement with no losses. And Luftwaffe intelligence, reading debriefing reports from pilots who'd encountered the tactic, began issuing warnings that would ultimately neutralize its effectiveness. By September 15, 1943, German fighter units across Western Europe had received tactical bulletins describing the American vapor trail deception maneuver. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, after interviewing 7 pilots who'd encountered it and survived, issued explicit guidance. Vapor trails from American fighters were no longer reliable indicators of catastrophic damage. Pilots were instructed to maintain firing discipline, observe the target aircraft's control surfaces for actual loss of control, and avoid following apparently damaged aircraft through extended dives without confirming the kill. The fuel dump decoy's operational lifespan was exactly 29 days. After mid-September, German pilots approached vapor-trailing American fighters with suspicion, breaking off attacks earlier, maintaining altitude advantage, refusing to commit to the dive. The tactic hadn't disappeared, but its effectiveness had dropped to near zero. American pilots who attempted it after September reported that German fighters would follow for 3 or 4 seconds, then abruptly break off and zoom back to altitude. The surprise was gone. Captain Robert McAllister flew 37 more combat missions with the 56th Fighter Group, claimed 2 additional aerial victories, and survived the war without additional injuries. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the August 17th engagement, though the citation described his actions as exceptional airmanship and tactical innovation under fire, without specifically mentioning the fuel dump maneuver. Post-war, he returned to Penn State, completed a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and worked for Republic Aviation until his retirement in 1978. In interviews conducted in the 1,980 seconds, he consistently downplayed the tactical significance of the maneuver, describing it as a desperation play that worked once because nobody expected it. The broader impact was more subtle and more lasting. American fighter doctrine in 1943 had been rigidly structured around prescribed maneuvers, energy management, and adherence to tactical formations. The fuel dump decoy demonstrated that unconventional approaches, even ridiculed or unauthorized ones, could exploit enemy expectations. Fighter Command didn't formally adopt the maneuver, but they did begin encouraging squadron commanders to allow tactical experimentation during training flights to reward innovation rather than punish deviation from doctrine. German intelligence assessments, captured after the war and declassified in the 1,970 seconds, reveal that Luftwaffe analysts viewed the fuel dump tactic as evidence of American willingness to sacrifice fuel reserves for tactical advantage, an assessment that fed into broader German perceptions of American material abundance. One Luftwaffe report from October 1943 noted, "Enemy fighters demonstrate increasing willingness to employ wasteful fuel consumption tactics. This suggests confidence in logistics and refueling capacity. Implications for extended combat operations unfavorable." The kill ratio between P-47 seconds and W-190 seconds never decisively favored the Americans during 1943. But it narrowed. By December, the exchange rate had shifted from 3 to 1 in Germany's favor to roughly even, a change attributed to multiple factors: improved pilot training, better tactical coordination, introduction of paddle blade propellers that enhanced P-47 performance, and perhaps most importantly, a psychological shift in American fighter pilot culture. They stopped running quite so predictably. They started taking calculated risks, and German pilots, who'd grown accustomed to American fighters diving away from every engagement, began to approach each encounter with slightly more caution, slightly more hesitation. In air combat, hesitation measures in fractions of seconds, and fractions of seconds determine who goes home. The story of McAllister's fuel dump decoy isn't ultimately about the tactic itself. It's about the space between doctrine and desperation, the moment when a pilot facing death decides that ridiculous is better than dead. Military organizations train for predictability, for repeatable procedures that work across 1,000 scenarios, flown by 1,000 different pilots. That training saves lives, but it also creates patterns, and patterns create vulnerability. The enemy learns your patterns as thoroughly as you learn them yourself. Innovation in combat comes from the margins, from pilots like McAllister, who get disciplined for violating fuel conservation protocols and then use that same violation to save their lives when it matters. It comes from officers like Schilling and Zemke, who recognize that a one-time psychological weapon has value even if it can't be formalized into doctrine. And it comes from the understanding that the enemy is learning too, adapting to your adaptations, studying your innovations, and turning them into predictable patterns of their own. 26,000 feet above the Dutch-German border, one pilot dumped 60 gallons of fuel, faked catastrophic damage, and reversed a pursuit that should have killed him. 29 days later, the tactic was obsolete. But for those 29 days, Luftwaffe pilots approached vapor-trailing American fighters with a flicker of doubt, a moment of hesitation, and in that moment, pilots who should have died went home instead. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one good trick, executed once, with perfect timing, changes everything for just long enough to matter. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold and underdocumented stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered with the technical detail and tactical context they demand, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What unconventional tactic or lesser-known engagement should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.